I'm Carol Sargent, and I was Father Drew's co-editor on two books, A World Free from Nuclear Weapons, the Vatican Conference on Disarmament. In 2020, it won a Catholic Media Association Award, which was very exciting. And we are preparing for Forbidden, receiving Pope Francis's condemnation of nuclear weapons, both from Georgetown University Press under our friend and colleague, Al Bertrand. And this panel, A New Start for Nuclear Arms Control, what I'll do is I'll briefly introduce everybody. I'll just give you a one-liner, but then as each person speaks, I'll give you a little bit more about them. So our four panelists are Ambassador James Goodby, Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, Daryl G. Kimball, Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. Jennifer McBee will be on video. She's Senior Fellow for International Security at the Federation of American Scientists. And then Greg Thielman, a current board member and former Senior Fellow at the Arms Control Association. And when Father Drew and I first met, I'll just say that I was living with progressive activist Catholic sisters, and they were involved in nuclear disarmament. And I thought I was just asking him for publishing advice, but he allowed me to join his Rome team in 2017 for the conference framing Pope Francis's historic condemnation of nuclear weapons. It was through him and through that experience that I met the thought leaders on this panel and in this room, and more broadly at this conference, that I got to know. And so, first we will hear from Ambassador Goodby. When James Goodby was ambassador to Finland, he worked on nuclear issues, including the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency and cooperative threat reduction. Besides teaching at Georgetown, he has also taught at Syracuse and Carnegie Mellon universities. He's author of the books At the Borderline of Armageddon, How American Presidents Managed the Atomic Bomb, and Europe Undivided, the latter from the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador Goodby.
Thank you very, very much. Well, it's going to be hard to come up to the same standard as a previous panel. I thought that was very, very interesting and very good. So I hope we can come somewhere near that mark. I'm going to begin by reminding you that there was a lot to be learned from what Father Drew had to say. I think you all know that, but I just want to say that I learned quite a bit in the last few years of his life. I became, I think, a very good friend of his, and likewise, he taught me things that I had never thought about before, and I want to talk about one of them this afternoon. There came a time when George Shultz, with whom I was working at the Hoover Institution, decided to convene a conference on the ethics and the morality of nuclear deterrence. Father Drew, of course, was invited, as were some others who are now in this discussion. In fact, we had, I think, Jerry Powers, and also Marianne was there as well. And it turned out to be a very useful thing, I think. One of the things that Father Drew said in that remark, in that conference, stayed with me for quite a long time, in fact, permanently, I guess. He spoke about what he called integral disarmament. And he spoke about it very poetically in an introduction to a book that his next book, I guess I should say, will be published soon. To him and to others in the Catholic Church who have spoken about integral disarmament, it refers to the idea that we not only are getting rid of nuclear weapons and other types of weapons, we are also getting rid of the hate in people's hearts. So what Father Drew called it was disarmament of hearts. And I subscribe to that idea because it has been obvious to me in the 50 or 60 years I've been working on these issues that those agreements that tend to be sustainable are agreements that have support among the masses of people, if you will, people who have become convinced that there are things that need to be done in the world and that some of these things that we've negotiated are good and ought to remain with us. So what I want to talk about really is how might the idea of integral disarmament be applied to the war in Ukraine now? How do we deal with that as a practical question? And here's what I have concluded. I think that it's very likely that there will not be a peace treaty in Ukraine. The Ukrainians and the Russians are, of course, both demanding things that are very unlikely to be met. It may well be that if there's an end to this war anytime soon, it'll be simply because if they've decided to have a ceasefire and will not have any agreement that settles anything having to do with frontiers or borders. That being the case, you cannot count on a negotiation over Ukraine to settle some of the issues that have arisen in Europe and in the world generally. You have to rely on a much broader basis. You have to do something that may have some chance of changing human hearts, to quote what Father Drew had to say about it. Now, it turns out that in Europe there has been a fairly long tradition, going back at least to 1975. That's not back to the Treaty at the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, but in 1975, the Helsinki Accords, the final act, they called it, was negotiated, and it had in it all of the kinds of things you'd expect to find in a document that is aiming at improving human rights, making war less likely, and so forth. And it seems to a lot of people who have studied this, as I have and others have as well, that Helsinki Final Act of 1975, signed by 35 heads of state and government, had a lot to do with the ending of the Cold War. It created an environment in Eastern Europe in particular where people were no longer willing to put up with the idea of being bossed and dominated and having dictatorships. And they came across the threshold, the idea that this is something that we can do something about. The Velvet Revolution, other revolutions took place, and eventually the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Was it all due to the Helsinki Final Act? No, but it certainly created a legal justification for taking action in order to make human rights a more common thing in Eastern Europe. Well, the Helsinki Final Act was succeeded by something called the Treaty of Paris for a New Europe in 1990. This is a year before the Soviet Union collapsed. 1991 came along and the Soviet Union did collapse. The states that emerged from that collapse, among them being Ukraine and the Russian Federation, continued to subscribe to the Treaty of Paris for a New Europe. They continue to subscribe to it today. And what I am thinking is that in order to create a situation in Eurasia, which is, I say that because there are now several of the Central Asian countries that are members of the Treaty of Paris, for Charter of Paris for a New Europe. And it's important, I think, to have those countries members of a system in which the Western countries are also important players. Russia and Ukraine are also part of it, of course. So what I am thinking we should be arguing is that we should not be leaving the question of peace in Europe just to Russia and Ukraine. We shouldn't be thinking about this as a war that we can settle by just letting it burn out. We should be using this occasion to create a stronger peace structure in Europe and in Eurasia. And so therefore, what I would argue to you is that we need to know more about that. I say that having lived with it for quite a long time, but as I talk with people about the OSCE, nobody that I talk with, very few anyway, know what it is or what it's done. In fact, it did quite a bit to try to head off the war in Ukraine. There have been missions, long-term missions they're called, sponsored by the OSCE in Ukraine. They had to do with not, observing elections. They had to do with trying to create conditions that would be more transparent so people would understand what was going on. The chairman in office, he's called, of the OSCE, just before the war broke out, announced a new consultative forum specifically designed to deal with the kinds of issues that Putin was raising about his problems in Ukraine. It was too late. I think Putin probably already decided he was going to invade. But those are the kinds of things that could have been done had they been started earlier on. And I think what we need to have now is a situation where the OSCE is given more support than has been the case, generally speaking. It's something that the U.S. has, I won't say paid lip service to, but they have not given it the same kind of funding levels and others that we do give to NATO, let's put it that way, just on the civilian side, not talking military. So how do you do that? Well, I think that what needs to be done is a group of people, private citizens mainly, ought to be convening a meeting in Vienna, which is the headquarters of the OSCE, to discuss, among other things, how do you go about strengthening the means of ensuring compliance with the obligations that have been undertaken by all these countries in the Charter for New Europe. What I'm saying is I don't think the governments are not likely to get onto this as rapidly as I think they probably should. And so I would love to see somebody take the lead in organizing a conference in Vienna. At Hoover, we have a partnership with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we've been talking with them about organizing a Track 2 meeting in Vienna sometime in April or May next year, specifically for this purpose. So I'm hoping that something will come of that will provide for Ukraine as well as for other countries in Europe a sense of security that I don't think they're going to derive from the ending of the war in Ukraine as things stand now. As I said, to my mind, it's rather unlikely there will be a real peace treaty, but we can organize something that, based on some of the already existing organizations, can create a stronger international order in Europe and probably in Eurasia as well. So that's my basic message for you. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And now Daryl Kimball has been the executive director of the Arms Control Association since a fascinating month. He started in September of 2001, and I'm sure that was very interesting. He contributes to its monthly journal, Arms Control Today. I was interested to see that he's been involved in peace his whole adult life, including winning the Ohio Governor's Youth Award for Peace back in 1985. So this is a real lifelong vocation for him. In over 2 decades at ACA, he's led on a range of issues. He's a frequent expert source for the media. National Journal called him one of the 10 key people you need to know because they're shaping the policy debate on the future of nuclear weapons. That was back in 2004. If you go to the website of the MacArthur Foundation, home of the Genius Grants, you'll see an impressive list of support for the organization, actually going back to the 80s. But in 2011, they won one of those Genius Grants. So, Daryl Kimball.
All right. Well, thank you, Carol. I'll try to live up to that Genius Grant designation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here to honor Father Drew Christensen's amazing life and legacy. And as many others have noted already, his teachings and writings focused on the ethical dimensions of nuclear weapons, the moral imperative to act to eliminate the nuclear weapons threat, and also on the practical steps necessary to eliminate nuclear dangers. And I've been asked to address the prospects for negotiations on strategic nuclear arms control. Jim just talked about the conventional arms control situation in the wake of the war of Ukraine. I'm going to try to talk about the prospects for resuming negotiations between the U.S. and Russia on strategic nuclear arms control. And I would say my bottom line is that it's not so much what are the prospects, but there is a necessity to pursue a legacy of work over the last 5 decades, the dialogue of peace, the dialogue of arms control and risk reduction that Father Drew talked about throughout his career, that has been part of the tradition of relations between the U.S. and Russia going back to the 1960s, as we heard about earlier today. And as Father Drew would have said if he were giving a talk here today about this issue, I think, it's clear that nuclear arms control talks through the decades have helped to keep the nuclear peace and made us all safer. As many of you already know, I mean, since 1972, since the first U.S.-Russian strategic arms control talks, which were conducted in the midst of enormous ideological conflict, a U.S. war in Indochina, enormous tensions, they succeeded in beginning the process of limiting and slowing the nuclear arms race. And we have, over the last 5 decades, seen through these agreements a huge reduction in the overall number of nuclear weapons. But to paraphrase another great moral leader who I'm inspired by, Coretta Scott King, she said at one point, freedom, and I would add progress in nuclear disarmament, is never really won. You earn it and win it with every generation. And so we're facing a moment here in the wake of the war by Russia on Ukraine in which the future of nuclear disarmament diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia is in a moment of peril. We have one agreement, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, remaining, limiting the world's 2 largest nuclear arsenals. It is due to expire on February 5, 2026, which is about 1,150 days away. And without arrangements to supersede that agreement, we won't have limits on the world's 2 largest arsenals for the first time since 1972. And so given that we cannot really remember a world in which we didn't have these kinds of agreements, I think it's fair to say that we will be living in a much more dangerous situation, even more dangerous than we're facing today, without progress in this area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we stand and where the 2 governments can and need to go. So the good news is that both President Biden and President Putin say they support talks on a new arrangement to limit their strategic nuclear arsenals. But since the start of the invasion, the dialogue between the U.S. and Russia on a new nuclear arms control framework has been on pause. The first time that we heard either president say something specific about this since the war began was in June. President Biden issued a statement in which he said, quote, "Our progress must continue beyond the New START extension." He said, "Even as we rally the world to hold Russia accountable for its brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine, we must continue to engage Russia on issues of strategic stability." And then for his part, in a June 30th talk in St. Petersburg, Putin said, quote, "Russia is open to dialogue on ensuring strategic stability, preserving agreements on the nonproliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and improving the situation in arms control," close quote. But with emotions running high over the war, we haven't seen the 2 governments resume the dialogue quite yet. On August 1, President Biden spoke out even more strongly in a statement at the beginning of the 10th Review Conference for the Non-Proliferation Treaty. He said, "Even at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to work together to uphold our shared responsibilities to ensure strategic stability. Today, my administration is ready to expeditiously negotiate a new nuclear arms control framework to replace New START when it expires in 2026, but negotiations require a willing partner operating in good faith." Now, what is he referring to? We've heard this operating in good faith phrase before. It is not entirely clear whether Russia is going to be serious when it comes to nuclear risk reduction and nuclear arms control, based upon the experience that Jim just referred to in the the last round of strategic stability talks before the war began, which was held in early February. And one other problem that exists is the fact that the United States and Russia are not even fully implementing the terms of the current agreement, New START. The inspections that are allowed under the New START treaty, each side can have 18 on-site inspections, have been suspended because of COVID. But the two governments have since early 2020. But the two sides have not been able to agree on the terms and conditions for the resumption of these on-site inspections. Long story short, the Russians complain that because of the restrictions that have been put on visas for Russian citizens coming to the United States, and because of the ban on commercial flights, they cannot conduct their inspections of U.S. facilities in the same manner the United States can conduct inspections of Russian facilities. And so on August the 8th, the Russians declared that they were suspending officially these inspections, even though they were already suspended because of COVID. So the two sides say they've been working to try to resume these inspections. I think there's a lot of distrust between the two sides to start with, but it is pretty clear that both sides want to resume these inspections. There is a meeting of what is called the Bilateral Consultative Commission, which is the group that has met regularly on implementation issues, U.S.-Russian officials on New START. The State Department just announced about a week ago that there would be a meeting of the Bilateral Consultative Commission soon. Other reports suggest that this could be by the end of this month, and they could be meeting in Cairo. If those talks, if that meeting happens and they resume the on-site inspection process, we could very well see the door opening for serious high-level U.S.-Russian talks on the next nuclear arms control agreement. And I'll get into some of the difficulties and the challenges just on the substantive issues that agreement or agreements might cover. But first, we also have to consider the fact that in this political climate of tension between the United States and Russia and our own domestic political chaos here in the United States, we already have some in Congress, Republican politicians, criticizing Biden for even trying to continue to implement the New START agreement. We have some hardline officials who have, I would call them members of the nuclear weapons deep state, who've been part of the Pentagon apparatus for many years, arguing that instead of negotiating a new agreement with Russia to at least maintain the New START limits, which are, remember, these are limits on deployed strategic warheads, 1,550 deployed strategic warheads each on 700 delivery vehicles. That's quite a lot of nuclear firepower. These critics say that limits the United States too much, partly because Russia is now clearly even more of a strategic foe, and because we've got to worry about China building up its nuclear arsenal in the future. Therefore, these officials, like Franklin Miller, who wrote in the Wall Street Journal in April, we need to increase the United States nuclear arsenal to about 3,500 deployed strategic nuclear weapons, and we need to pull out of the New START treaty. So this is the kind of thinking that President Biden and his team are going to be running into when and if these talks open up, and this issue really hits the headlines. So far, this has been a behind-the-scenes issue that you can best track in Arms Control Today magazine, probably. Now, the other factor that is going to be working against the prospects for nuclear arms control agreement is time, of course. February 5, 2026 is not long from now. These talks have not already started. Most strategic nuclear arms control agreements take at least a year, if not longer, to negotiate. One of the major obstacles getting something done is simply going to be time, let alone some of the issues the two sides are going to have to cover. What are the issues the two sides are going to have to cover? Let me just tick off some of these, and we can get into a little bit more discussion in detail if you'd like. But as we know, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty limits strategic nuclear arsenals only. So one of the issues will be do we maintain these limits at the 1,550 level? Do we try to go lower? Do we try to simply replicate this agreement? That's probably going to be the major negotiating priority for both sides, because this has been the most important single aspect of their nuclear arsenals. But another issue that's going to come up, the United States is going to want to begin to talk about tactical nuclear weapons, the shorter range nuclear weapons that we've all been hearing about in the headlines lately, the kinds of nuclear weapons that Putin has threatened that he might use against Ukraine in order to overcome his battlefield losses. These have never been part of a nuclear arms control agreement. The Russians have somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 of these. The United States has several hundred, about 150 of which are deployed in Europe. That is going to be a very difficult area to cover. They probably will need to start with just some simple reporting and accounting and maybe some light inspections in order to get a handle on how many nuclear weapons and where, tactical nuclear weapons and where each side has. They're also going to have to be thinking about how to limit the intermediate range missiles and nuclear warheads that were once covered by the INF Treaty of 1987, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Both sides say they want to explore this. The Russians have actually put a proposal on the table to ban intermediate range missiles that can carry nuclear warheads from Greater Europe. That is probably an imperfect proposal, but it's a starting point for the United States and Russia to begin talking about ways in which to recover some of the limits that the INF Treaty had placed on both sides. And then they're going to have to also talk about how U.S. missile defenses affect strategic stability. The Russians continue to be concerned about the United States ever expanding ballistic missile capabilities, which at the moment cannot affect their strategic missiles, but at some point in the future they might, depending on where they're deployed. So at the very least, each side is going to have to come to these talks with some ideas about how to assure the other about, especially the United States towards Russia, how U.S. missile defenses, which are designed to deal with rogue states like North Korea, from affecting the U.S.-Russian balance of terror. And then finally, one aspect of the U.S.-Russian talks that I think both sides will have in mind is how, at some point in the future, they can engage other nuclear-armed countries in the disarmament process. You all talked about this a little bit in the previous panel. So far, France, the UK, China, the other 3 members of the NPT who have nuclear weapons have not been part of any nuclear arms control or disarmament negotiation. If we're going to make progress in the future, longer term, that's going to have to change. The Russians insist that if we're going to go forward and reduce substantially U.S.-Russian arsenals, then Britain and France need to be involved. The United States insists that China is going to have to be involved somehow. So one possibility would be to involve all 5 in a dialogue, which has already begun, called the P5 process, that has been underutilized. This is a once-a-year meeting of senior leaders to discuss risk reduction concepts, nuclear terminology. It could be expanded in order to become a forum for serious proposals about nuclear arms control involving all 5 of the nuclear armed states. So that's something the United States government, I think, needs to take advantage of and think creatively about. The United States is the current chair of this P5 process. This is something that Secretary of State Tony Blinken might take with him when he visits these ideas to Beijing next year for a trip that was just announced this morning. So in sum, the prospects are for strategic nuclear arms control in the near term are extremely difficult, but we can and must push ahead. It's going to require, as usual, presidential leadership, but it's also going to take the members of this community, the people who Father Drew brought together and beyond, to focus on this very important near-term task that is essential to peace building and the longer-term enterprise of nuclear disarmament. The next couple of years are going to be absolutely vital.
Thank you. And now making video comments, Jennifer Mackbee, who's a senior fellow for international security at the Federation of American Scientists. She focuses on international security, nonproliferation, and arms control issues, and is a senior advisor for the Partnership for a Secure America.
Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Mackbee from the Federation of American Scientists. I handled the negotiations on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in Geneva, and I worked at the organization implementing the treaty in Vienna called the CTBTO. I'm very sorry I cannot join you here today in person, but I have been abroad to speak at other meetings which made it impossible for me to be in DC. I'm honored to be included in this important event honoring Drew Kirstensen. His strong interest in nuclear disarmament is an inspiration to us all. Indeed, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty calls on the parties to pursue new negotiations on the cessation of the nuclear arms race and nuclear disarmament. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty has been seen for years as a first step in that direction towards nuclear disarmament. This year is the 25th anniversary of the CTBT's opening for signature. With a number of countries joining recently, the treaty has now been ratified by all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as on Southeast Asia. This is a significant achievement. The number of ratifications is now 176, with 186 signatures, making it close to universal. The new executive secretary of the CTBTO, Rob Floyd, recently called the treaty already a success for creating and maintaining a powerful norm against nuclear testing, and sustaining a powerful universal support as every country agrees with the objectives of the treaty. However, you may know that entry into force of the CTBT is held up because 8 countries still need to ratify for that to happen. These 8 include China, North Korea, Egypt, India, Iran, Israel, Pakistan, and the United States. Yet most of the 8 countries seem to recognize the value of the treaty and its international monitoring system. The treaty has established a highly respected norm by now, and the only country to have tested in this century is North Korea. The challenges facing the treaty's entry into force are mostly political. It also faces a few other challenges, as I shall explain. During a period spanning more than 5 decades, more than 2,000 nuclear test explosions were carried out, most of them by the United States and the former Soviet Union. They were detonated in about 23 places around the world, and more than 500 were conducted in the atmosphere. Over the decades, generations of people called for a treaty banning nuclear testing. Each of the 5-year review conferences of the NPT called for a CTBT. And although states at the recent review conference this last August found other issues to argue about, most delegations from all regions supported the CTBT in their statements to the general debate, and they submitted 20 working papers that considered the treaty. The CTBT negotiations agreed in 1996 that the treaty would prohibit all nuclear test explosions of any yield by all states and in all environments. The basic obligation was one of the most difficult to negotiate, but finally all agreed on a zero-yield ban that would not allow any explosion involving release of nuclear energy. The challenge of detecting a nuclear weapon test explosion anywhere in the world is daunting. The verification provisions of the CTBT are more intrusive than those of other treaties. The International Monitoring System comprises 337 stations and laboratories situated in 89 countries around the world, which you see here on this map. These stations provide nearly even distribution of detection capabilities around the globe. The stations are seismic, radionuclide, hydroacoustic, and infrasound, which capture signals coming through the earth, the water, and the atmosphere. More than 90% of these facilities in the system have been installed already around the world. Installing them and maintaining them is also a challenge. Data is sent from these stations to an international data center in Vienna, which processes and analyzes it. The IMS stations provide high-quality data and monitoring capabilities that in many cases surpass what the negotiators expected during the time of negotiating the treaty. In addition, simulated on-site inspections in Kazakhstan and in Jordan have demonstrated significant progress toward the completion of an on-site inspection regime. The very large scale month-long field exercise in Jordan in 2014 involved more than 200 scientific experts and personnel and 150 tons of equipment in 1,000 square kilometers of desert next to the Dead Sea and Mount Nebo, where Moses saw the promised land, according to the Old Testament. Originally, when the treaty opened for signature in 1996, everyone thought that the entry into force would be imminent, and there was great momentum and excitement about installing the complex of stations around the world. However, the issue of entry into force has become a challenge. This article proved to be the most contentious and caused more antagonism than any other in the negotiations. The one thing that the nuclear weapon states, and that's China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US, agreed upon was that all 5 of them would have to join for entry into force. Not one was willing to allow any of the others off the hook. They also did not want a situation to occur whereby they were the only states required to ratify, as then other countries might test while they, the 5, were prohibited from doing so. Negotiators proposed many other suggestions, but in the end, the treaty specified that entry into force would occur when all countries on the list of 44 states who were both participating in the negotiations and also appeared on the IAEA lists of nuclear power and research reactors ratified. This option was the path of least resistance, and although it could mean a long time for entry into force, this was better than the risk of no treaty, which seemed the only other option. Here you see the list of countries, and the ones in bold are obviously the ones that still have not ratified. So if we speak on a regional level, in 2016, Pakistan proposed a legally binding test ban with India. Many believe that Pakistan is waiting for India to sign and ratify the CTBT, while India in turn is waiting for China, and China is waiting for the United States. A similar situation might be playing out in the Middle East with Egypt, Iran, and Israel. Many believe that if the US ratifies, the others will follow. However, in recent years, the US has been urging the other countries to ratify without waiting for the US. All of the countries in question participated actively in the negotiations in Geneva. Some experts have suggested that the US and China sign at the same time, simultaneously, which would be seen as a major step forward, and both could claim a positive achievement. Israel has said that its position on entry into force depends on the overall regional situation, the completion of the treaty's verification regime, and Israel's status in the policy-making organs of the treaty. Egypt has said that it will not ratify the CTBT or other disarmament-related agreements until Israel joins the NPT. Iran has been occupied with the ramifications of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. Of course, Iran has said it has no interest in building a bomb. However, it has resumed further enrichment of uranium after the US pulled out of the JCPOA. The regional tensions in the Middle East might not be solved soon, but the ratification of CTBT by Egypt, Iran, and Israel might help assuage the security situation and would certainly help break the logjam on entry into force. In this connection, it should be noted that countries cannot call for an on-site inspection until the treaty enters into force. And I would note that the US has accused Russia of possible non-compliance with the treaty, but here it should be noted that Russia ratified the CTBT in 2000, and the US has not done so. So now I come to the future, which is a challenge. As you have seen, the challenge for the entry into force is mostly political. Domestically, the treaty will not be put in front of the US Senate for a vote until the votes are there. This is unlikely to happen soon. However, fortunes can change overnight. For example, generations of people waited for a negotiation on the CTBT, And when the US made the decision finally to engage in 1993, the negotiations took off like a spaceship, meeting in the morning, afternoon, and evenings in order to complete it by the date stipulated in the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference. Another challenge, scientists have told me, is investing in the monitoring stations to maintain and improve on their high quality. In addition, states need to continue to attract the world's top young scientists to work in the CTBTO, as well as in their scientific national labs and the national data centers. So the treaty has established a strong norm against nuclear testing. The new executive secretary is emphasizing universalization. Once he gets all but the 8 required holdouts on board, the pressure will mount on the 8, and we will see what happens. Thank you very much.
And now Greg Thielman, who is a retired diplomat, current board member, and former senior fellow at the Arms Control Association. His over 30 years in the executive and legislative branches of the government included foreign service assignments in Brasilia, Bonn, Moscow, Geneva, on the US INF treaty negotiating team. And you know, he didn't necessarily think that this needed to be included, but I wanted to include it. He was being more modest about it. But his last State Department job was heading the Office of the Intelligence in the Intelligence Bureau, INR, which correctly assessed that Iraq's nuclear weapons program in 2002 was dormant and was the only member of the U.S. intelligence community to do so. Greg Thielman.
That tidbit, I think, is supposed to disguise the fact that I'm not only the last, but the least of the distinguished panelists that you've heard today. Russia's aggression against Ukraine on February 24th of the current year was in many ways a continuation of Russia's move into Crimea 8 years ago, followed 2 months later by Russian-backed forces seizing portions of the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. Even though all of these developments constituted violations of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, it is Moscow's behavior in 2022 which has posed the greatest threat to international order and nuclear nonproliferation efforts. Putin's justification for Russia's initial aggression against Ukraine bears some similarity to Hitler's 1938 claim to the Sudetenland, the historic German-speaking portion of Czechoslovakia, which Britain and France ceded to the Germans at Munich. Abandoned by London and Paris, and with its fortified border region stripped away, Prague fell to Nazi Germany only 5 months later. But in the case of Ukraine, the West opposed rather than facilitated the initial aggression, and 8 years later, Kyiv fought back furiously in the face of further aggression, so far accomplishing what Czechoslovakia could not. Yet Ukraine's brave resistance and the West's stalwart support have not been able to silence completely a very unfortunate lesson some are learning from the Ukraine crisis. To protect themselves from being attacked by and occupied by states with nuclear weapons, states need to develop and deploy their own nuclear weapons, or at least be allied to states that do possess them. So my task today is to discuss how we can influence what lessons are learned from the war in Ukraine, advancing the objectives of the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Membership in the NPT is nearly universal, but includes only 5 of the 9 nuclear weapon states. Some years ago, Ambassador Tom Graham succinctly summarized the 3 commitments embedded in this treaty. The NPT non-nuclear weapon states agree never to acquire nuclear weapons. The NPT nuclear weapon states agree to share the benefits of peaceful nuclear technology and to pursue nuclear disarmament aimed at the ultimate elimination of their nuclear arsenals. So the treaty addresses 2 types of proliferation: horizontal proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons to non-nuclear weapon states, and vertical proliferation, the existing nuclear weapon states increasing the size and role of their nuclear arsenals. The most worrisome proliferation impact of Russia's invasion is that countries currently without nuclear weapons will be prompted to develop and deploy their own. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Ukraine's experience constitutes a setback to the NPT's horizontal nonproliferation objectives. But I also agree with former State Department nonproliferation official Bob Einhorn when he said, Russia's invasion does not seem to be the proliferation trigger that many analysts predicted. And in the October issue of Arms Control Today, Einhorn elaborates on the states of particular proliferation concern. European frontline states are reassured by the Biden administration's reassurances of NATO's nuclear umbrella. The requests of Sweden and Finland for NATO membership underscore that confidence. Despite anxieties about North Korea's nuclear weapons, Einhorn judges neither Japan nor South Korea as likely to develop their own. Given its dependence on the United States, Taiwan also recognizes the downsides of seeking nuclear weapons. Even after the Trump administration violated the U.S. commitment to the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, Tehran's acquisition of nuclear weapons is not inevitable, as Einhorn concludes. And he says that Iran will still be driven fundamentally by the regime's calculations of its own regional and domestic interests, not by any lessons from the war in Ukraine. And Einhorn judges Saudi Arabia's potential interest in nuclear weapons is independent of the war in Ukraine and based almost entirely on its judgment that Iran is determined to be nuclear armed. So the broad outlines of US and Soviet doctrine regarding nuclear weapons use have not changed very much since rough parity was achieved by the two countries during the 1970s. Nuclear arms were regarded as weapons of last resort, used principally to deter war rather than to fight it. Furthermore, the US and Soviet Union or Russia have on multiple occasions since 1987 declared that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Moreover, since the US and 4 other nuclear weapon states ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states have been formally committed to eventual nuclear disarmament. Article 6 of the NPT treaty commits the treaty parties, quote, to pursue negotiation in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. So nuclear arms control treaties and the consultative groups that they have generated have until recently curbed the most acute fears of nuclear war, even when war breaks out between a state with nuclear weapons and one without, as it did in the Falklands-Malvinas conflict between Argentina and the UK in 1982. Throughout the Cold War, US nuclear doctrine included the option of being the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. During the last 3 decades, the US retained the first use option, mostly to reassure US allies like the Baltic republics that Russia would not be able to successfully exploit these states' vulnerabilities to intimidation or conventional aggression. Ironically, Russia has leaned lately more heavily on the option of being the first to use nuclear weapons because of the growing imbalance between NATO and Russian conventional forces. Over time in the post-Cold War era, US administrations began giving increasing consideration to restricting the role of US nuclear weapons in national security policy. And I'd like to quote a statement that Joe Biden made in 2017. The President and I strongly believe we have made enough progress toward creating the conditions for this sole purpose doctrine. Well, then the administration of Donald Trump came along, implying movement in the opposite direction, emphasizing that the U.S. would consider employing a nuclear weapon in response to a non-nuclear strategic attack and increasing the role of nuclear weapons. Back comes Biden, and the earlier conviction featured prominently in his 2020 campaign for president with his explicit commitment to switch to a sole purpose nuclear doctrine, meaning that the U.S. would only use nuclear weapons to prevent or respond to another nation's nuclear attack. But we now know that Biden's election victory in 2020 did not lead his administration to reduce the role of nuclear weapons by altering U.S. nuclear doctrine. Instead, the recently completed Nuclear Posture Review has maintained the option of using nuclear weapons first, even in response to non-nuclear attacks. And the NPR language says that the U.S. would only consider the first use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States or its allies and partners. Equally disappointing, Biden's defense budget has included an increase in nuclear spending over that of his predecessor. Doctrine and budget combined to hollow out the president's campaign pledge to decrease the role of nuclear weapons. Russian nuclear doctrine under Putin has moved backwards from Russia's 3-decade-long pledge to only utilize nuclear weapons if the very existence of the nation were threatened. Washington's failure to adjust its doctrine to the post-Cold War world has blurred Putin's backsliding over Ukraine. Putin's ominous threats were made initially to prevent other countries from coming to Kyiv's aid, and later to compensate for Russia's military failures. Despite Biden's efforts to avoid direct confrontation between the two nuclear powers, Putin implied in October that Moscow's nuclear weapons would be used to defend occupied regions of Ukraine that he claimed as Russian territory. And it's good to see there's some backsliding in his statements on that, in that regard. Even though the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York failed in August to reach agreement on the path ahead, there were also hopeful signs that Russia continues to accept the necessity of observing the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which has been mentioned that will expire in 2026, and also to resume stability talks with Washington that Darrell had elaborated on. Beyond using Ukraine's successful defense to strengthen the international taboo against changing international borders by force, I believe the war offers an opportunity to combat the vertical proliferation of nuclear weapons. There is no aspect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine which justifies current levels of U.S. and Russian strategic forces. There is considerable speculation about whether Russia would risk a limited use of tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Although any nuclear use seems unlikely, unleashing the vast strategic arsenals of the U.S. and Russia would be even more so. The existing strategic treaty regime permits each side to deploy 1,550 warheads on 700 delivery vehicles. These numbers have been mentioned. But the marginal utility of the 1,550th nuclear warhead is virtually zero. The importance of, sorry for Frank Miller, he doesn't quite agree with that, but that's my strong view. The importance of continuing reductions beyond New START and increasing the survivability of strategic forces is enhanced, not diminished, by the war in Ukraine. The current limits on both sides need to be reduced further, and strategic missile defenses need to be included in the equation. The mutual obligations on both sides to host on-site inspections and provide data on testing and deployment locations needs to be further strengthened as well. Moreover, the need for deeper cuts in nuclear forces is further strengthened by recent studies suggesting the Earth's climate and economic structure are far more vulnerable than previously understood to lasting damage of a nuclear war. And Jonathan mentioned that even a small portion of this could threaten essentially the civilization we know. The latest calculation of fatalities from a full-scale U.S.-Russia nuclear exchange is 5 billion inhabitants of our planet. And this is what I would call climate change on steroids. One hopes that Russia is learning some painful lessons in Ukraine about the disutilities and dangers of nuclear weapons. May we do likewise and act on our newfound wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you. And now as we go to the Q&A, I would ask you, when you ask a question, if you would do us the honor of giving us your first and last name, honorific if appropriate, and also a little context on your presence here today. That would be wonderful. Thank you very much. And do we have questions for our panel? Yes.
Jonathan Granoff. Is it on? Yes. Yeah. Global Security Institute. Could you comment on the possibility of the United States moving a Security Council resolution declaring that any further testing of nuclear weapons would be a threat to international security and thus prohibited? So we didn't have to go through the ratification process. The UN Charter is a fully ratified treaty. The UK, Russia, and France have already ratified the treaty. It would only be getting China on board, and then testing would be legally prohibited. Also, if you could comment about moving a no first use or sole purpose pledges with respect to finding some common ground and getting nukes off the table in the Ukraine crisis.
I can take a whack at your questions, Jonathan. Your first question about utilizing the UN Security Council to strengthen the norm against nuclear testing is a good one. I mean, those of us who've been working to bring the CTBT into force have thought about a lot of different options. I mean, Jim Goodby spent more time on this than I have, having worked on a post-Senate defeat of the CTBT report for President Clinton with General Shalikashvili. I would say that the Security Council is an important vehicle for reinforcing the norm. There was a resolution that was passed in September of 2016, led by the United States to reinforce the value of the CTBT. But the Security Council is just not going to be able to, for political reasons, establish that nuclear testing is illegal through that means. I mean, I think it's going to be impossible for the rest of the member states of the UN General Assembly to respect that, even if it's legally possible to do this on paper. But the Security Council is one of the many tools we're going to have to use in order to reinforce the norm against nuclear weapons testing by any and all states until such time as the CTBT does enter into force. I mean, my take on the CTBT is that it is a rousing, amazing success in that it has stopped what it was designed to do. We'll see if North Korea continues to respect that. But, and so whether the treaty is in force or not, we have a challenge with every decade, with every treaty banning weapons of mass destruction to reinforce the norm. And that's no different for the CTBT as it is for the Chemical Weapons Convention or the norm against nuclear weapons use. Very quickly on how how we can dissuade Putin and others from threatening to use nuclear weapons. I think one of the most important things that we need to be trying to do right now is to have more countries, especially countries that are somewhat aligned with Russia or who are neutral in this conflict, to be speaking out against nuclear threats of any kind, and certainly nuclear use of any kind. And we saw just in recent weeks some helpful statements from the Indian defense minister to his Russian counterpart saying that nuclear weapons use should be off the table, and from the Chinese government. There was a statement by President Xi when the Chancellor of Germany visited saying that nuclear weapons should not be considered as part of this conflict. More of that is necessary. We also need to be arguing here in the United States, and I think President Biden is already convinced of this, but not everyone. If Putin were to use nuclear weapons, the United States should not respond with nuclear weapons. So this is not a first use issue, this is a second use issue. And the reason why, and I was thinking about this when we were discussing the just war doctrine issue, this is not just an issue for the Ukraine crisis, this is an issue for the world, because if President Biden or NATO were to make a decision to reply to Russian tactical nuclear weapons use in Ukraine with nuclear weapons, that would create the high likelihood that the entire world would be engulfed in a nuclear catastrophe. So, this is not just a decision for Biden to make. It's, of course, would be the wrong decision. There are other means by which we can respond if Putin were to take this disastrous step. Other thoughts from my fellow
Other
panelists?
thoughts? Yeah.
I don't know.
I might just offer the somewhat unusual optimism about North Korea, and that is, I think because Kim Jong-un does not think that he needs a sophisticated nuclear weapon, that there is actually a chance to convince North Korea to not test nuclear weapons and to, in effect, adhere to the nuclear testing ban. There would obviously have to be some sort of a gesture or concession. He would have to get something out of this kind of deal. But I do not see it as unlikely as getting Israel to give up the nuclear option, for example. And so it encourages me to at least fantasize that North Korea, which is generally perceived as the toughest nut to crack, on this issue of not testing nuclear weapons, I think we might have a chance. That doesn't mean that he would get rid of his arsenal of nuclear weapons, but I think he could be persuaded not to test them.
My name is Bill Spielberger. I'm a Chicago lawyer. I two questions to Ambassador Goodby. Number one, what are your thoughts about Finland's efforts to join NATO? And number two, I've read that Russia has been testing high-level explosives in the seas near Finland, and your thoughts about that?
Well, Finland has been closely aligned with the West throughout the Cold War. The idea of Finlandization has always been a troublesome term for them, and for me too, personally, because they've really done everything they can to be a good Western country. And of course, they went through the Winter War. They were invaded by the Soviet Union, just as Ukraine has been invaded, and that of course, rang a bell with them. And so they have made the decision, and it's been accepted by NATO, that they should become members. It's going to take a little while to get through all of the examination and so forth of what it is they bring to bear, but they and Sweden both will will strengthen NATO. And I think most of the Finns, in fact, I would guess 90% of the Finns are happy about this outcome. I can't speak about the explosions. I had not heard about that, but of course, anything that is in that vicinity of the Baltic states and Finland is a place that Putin will probably try to frighten, by such things as that.
I read that it was actually a seismologist in Finland that just 3 weeks ago that detected large grade explosions in the seas near Finland. And of course, the question is whether those explosions are tests by the Russians, but also if it's at all related to Finland's efforts to join NATO. So that's.
And we're going to wrap it up on this. Yeah.
Well, I think unlikely there'd be nuclear explosions, because I would guess we would have picked up some radiation from it if it had been nuclear. But I think that you can count on the Russians to keep trying to do whatever they can to worry the countries on its border. It's just what they've been doing.
Very good. And I would like to thank Ambassador Goodby, Daryl Kimball, Jennifer McBee, who was on video, and Greg Thielman. And I'd also like to extend warm thanks to this group and invite you to the President's Room, which is the room right out there and across the way, for a reception. In all my years of working at Georgetown, I never knew it was called the President's Room. I found that out today. And and you can also check out the portrait of Father Healy. There's a match, or there's like a business card in his hand, but I'm told that it was originally a cigarette and then they painted over it or something. I don't know if that's an urban legend or whether that's really true, but you can ask the Jesuits for feedback. So thank you very much.